Okay, in this video I'm going to show you how to use the discriminant and the purpose of using the discriminant is to find out how many solutions you have. Well, to know how many real solutions you have. And how many non-real solutions. Well, you will have two, but I'll put that anyway. The discriminant comes from the quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. The discriminant comes from this, and the part of the formula that is the discriminant is what's under the square root. The reason why we can use what's under the square root to find how many solutions we have is the solutions are whenever two things are equal to each other, right? So if what's inside this square root, if it turns out that what's inside the square root is 0, if it turns out to be 0, then that means that we really just have our answer for x in the quadratic formula. Our answer for x in this case would be negative b divided by 2a plus 0. And if we're adding 0, it's like we didn't do anything. So then if what's in the discriminant, if what's under the square root turns out to be 0, then that means we have one solution. We have one solution if b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0. And all of your work yesterday and the day before, whenever we plugged in numbers, x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. Whenever we were doing work the other day, you always got a positive number in here. So, for example, let's try the first one on this worksheet. x squared plus 6x plus 10 equals 0. If we were going to solve this and find out how many solutions, we could plug it into the quadratic formula, but the only important part of the quadratic formula that we really need is this. So if I only need b squared minus 4ac, then I'm not really solving for x. I'm only going to look for that. b squared minus 4ac is called the discriminant. So then if I plug in the numbers, it would be 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10, 36 minus 40. 36 minus 40 is negative 4. So I have a negative answer for my discriminant. That means if I was solving for x, if I did use quadratic formula, the discriminant already told us something, but if we plug that number into the quadratic formula, it'll tell us what it really means. It means that b squared minus 4ac, which is what's under the square root, what's in here, would be a negative 4. And then we would divide by 2a. In yesterday's video, I showed that if you have the square root of a negative number, then what you do is you pretend that number is positive, and then you put an I on it. So now we have negative b plus or minus the square root of 4i divided by 2a. And that I means imaginary or non-real. And it's also called a complex number. So since we have this part, we have a non-real part means no solution. Well, no real solutions. That means if you were trying to answer this question, you couldn't unless you bring in the very complicated, well, not complicated, to an extent, the complex numbers. But that's explaining them is something for a different video. Next example. X squared minus 8x plus 15. X squared minus 8x plus 15. If we're looking at the discriminant, that's b squared minus 4ac. B squared minus 4ac. So negative 8 squared minus 4 times 15 times 1. 64 minus 60 equals 4. And since this number is positive, that means if you did plug it into the quadratic formula, you would have the square root of 4. You would have negative b plus or minus the square root of 4 divided by 2a. Since the square root of 4 is a regular number, that means that if we were to actually solve for x, then we would have to add 2 for one of the answers and subtract 2 for one of the other answers. And it's because that we would have to add or subtract to get two different answers that if b squared minus 4ac, is greater than 0, then we have two real solutions. Anytime you square b and you subtract 4ac, if it's bigger than 0, then that quadratic is going to have two real solutions. Up here, we said that if b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, if we are equal to 0, then you only have one solution. And what I didn't write here, but I can write now, a non-real part has no real solutions if b squared minus 4ac, let me write this in a different color. If b squared minus 4ac is less than 0. If it's less than 0, then that means it's negative. And if it's negative, that means that you're going to do the square root of a negative. And you can't do the square root of a negative without using imaginary numbers. And because they're imaginary numbers, that means that there are no real solutions. So if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, then no real solutions exist.